All right, we're back at it. So, we're going to keep talking about strategic planning, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the core principles of successfully implementing a strategic plan. So, you have a beautiful plan, it's on a piece of paper, but that's like literally just the beginning, right? You have to actually implement it effectively within an organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I talked about scenario planning earlier as one of the components of the strategic planning process that allows us to start to begin to navigate an uncertain future and think through what would be the tactics or objectives that we would want to pursue as an organization if the future world looked certain different ways. Because at the end of the day, no one has a crystal ball. We can't accurately say 5 years from now, I know the world's going to look like this, so I'm going to develop a plan for it. One really great quote that I like about strategic planning was from General Eisenhower. People know who he was. He's the American general who led the Allies on the invasion of the continent in World War II, Allied invasion. And he said, when the first bullet goes off in battle, battle plans are totally useless. But battle planning is indispensable. So you could literally replace that with strategic planning. You could say, to some extent, strategic plans, if you don't predict the future right, is kind of useless, but the exercise of planning was very important. And here's a really good example of this. So when COVID hit, our organization, like you all, like everyone, we found ourselves in a very, very uncertain future. And so we had to plan for what are we going to do. And one of the exercises we went through is, okay, it's 2020. Let's think about what the world could look like in 2023. And I was looking at the slide yesterday and I was like, you know what? I haven't actually looked at this since 2020 when we did this exercise, and now it's 2023. So it's really interesting to see what we came up with 3 years ago. And one of the tools we used, and I think it's a really great tool that you all should think about using in your own strategic planning process, is to develop a 2x2 scenario matrix of what the world could look like. And for this, you try to focus on what are the two most impactful or important or maybe likely variables that could change with time. And to map it out on a 2x2 and start to fill it in to say, okay, what would the world look like if these variables work together in a certain way? To get that conversation then going of, okay, well, what would we do if the world looked like this? So in 2020, when COVID was, we did this in June, so COVID of 2020, so COVID would have been, 3 months old at that point, right? It hit the States in March in a real way. We picked two variables. One was, we framed it as the decline in available funding, but basically it was, would less money be coming into the organization, right? That could come in so many different forms. That could come in the form as less government funding. That could come in the form of less patients coming to CHOP. We in the US, especially in pediatrics, our main financial model is the more patients you see, the more you get paid. So we're volume based. In most circumstances, not all. And then the other variable was, okay, well, just how prevalent is COVID? are we going to be in this like, so in America, I think, what was a high day? 2,000 deaths a day? Was that kind of the height? Something like that? So, are we going to be experiencing 2,000 deaths a day in the country every day for still 3 years from now? Or is it going to be, much more, much less prevalent? So what you do then is you say, all right, for variable A, in this case the state of COVID, low prevalence to high prevalence, funding, limited or significant. So in this case, is there a significant decline in funding or is there a limited decline in funding? And then you start to kind of draw out or narrate what would the world look like. So this hard time scenario is like the worst possible case scenario. It's COVID still 3 years later is raging, high prevalence, and there's huge declines in revenue for the hospital. And you can see this is what we came up with, is what it could look like. That there are still persistent outbreaks, that lockdowns 3 years later are still happening. There's a really deep recession. There's cuts to reimbursement. And the government is running out of money, so we have to fund all of our own research. We can't rely on government funding for research anymore. If we found ourselves in that scenario, what would we have to do to maintain our sustainability so that we can advance our mission, advance our vision? We worked with the executive group on this, and we actually did a poll, and we asked them, which scenario do you think is going to be most likely 3 years from now? Just shell it out, which one do you think they picked? It's kind of interesting to think about. What? The worst one? Anyone else have a different? B? C. So in between B and D. So we were wrong. That's not literally, that's what we thought today would be. We were wrong. No recession in the United States. In-person care is higher than it's ever been. And there's really, things are kind of back to normal, I don't know, and so we were wrong. But it's interesting to look back and think about, and you're correct, people definitely, they think the worst is gonna happen, they plan for the worst, but this type of exercise really allows you to test one if I'm wrong, right? So, in summary for planning, and then we're going to talk a little bit about implementation. If you take away anything, I would really hope you take away these first 3 bullets. It allows for the development of goals and initiatives to help to achieve a vision of the future. I've been talking, the language I've been using today is strategic objectives and tactics. And so when just to make clear, when I talk about strategic objectives, the person that wrote the slide is calling it goals, but it's really one of those 3 to 5 things, those top strategic priorities that we need to focus on to achieve our mission and our vision. And then initiatives, I've been using the word tactics, but it can be the same thing. Under each of those strategic objectives or goals, what are those 5 to 7 efforts that we really need to push on to achieve that top level objective? There was another great question during our coffee break. I had said earlier in the presentation, when we were talking about the 5 phases of strategic planning, that you start with your mission and your vision. and then you work through the phases, and at the end, you may find that the original mission or vision was not actually the right vision, because you collected a lot of information that told you something new. So somebody in the group, one of your colleagues asked, isn't it demoralizing to a group if you're like always changing your mission and vision every 5 years? And I think she's absolutely right. Think about it. If every 5 years the hospital had a different, like, we care about patients. Now 5 years later we care just about making money, and 5 years later we just care about research. That would be demoralizing, right? And so a mission and vision ideally should not change every strategic planning cycle. But missions and visions, we can think about them changing, not on a 5-year time horizon, but maybe they change over the course of a generation, right? Or maybe they change over the course of 100 years. Because the world changes a lot in 5 years, but in a lot of ways it doesn't change, right? A lot in 5 years. And so I definitely wouldn't want you all to take away from this that every 5 years, your department or your organization should be changing its mission. A mission and vision should be pretty darn constant for a period of time, but it also isn't sacrosanct, meaning it shouldn't be untouchable either. If the world changes enough and the strategic planning process develops a lot of good information that says, we may have been trying to solve the wrong thing this whole time, you should consider maybe changing your mission and vision. But a good organization has one that can really stand the test of time, or at least a generation. The second important piece, involve a wide range of stakeholders. We talked a lot about that. And robust communication is really, really important. People don't understand the why behind the strategy, let alone even know what the strategy is. You're not going to be too successful in achieving it. And then scenario planning, which we just did with that 2x2, allows for testing of strategies against an uncertain future, because nobody really knows the future. When I first worked in strategic planning, I thought I had to be right, and I was always like hard on myself when I was wrong. And it took a couple years to realize, oh my God, I'm going to be wrong more times than not. And it's the act of planning that's really important. You're not always going to get the future right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about implementation. And then I will open it up for questions before handing it off to Scott. So we talked a little bit about this already. Implementation planning should be a part of strategic planning. There should be and that was phase 5 of our process map. You shouldn't just develop a plan and then think, all right, someone else is going to go execute on it. The people that are going to be involved in executing that plan have to be involved in the planning too. So there has to be overlap between the strategic planning process and the strategy implementation process. It does no good if my department does strategic planning in a vacuum. We're not clinicians. We are not operators. If we developed plans without engaging the operational and clinical expertise, that plan is doomed for failure because 1, we will have had no idea what we were talking about, and 2, we weren't engaging all of the people that are actually going to be responsible for making the plan happen. And then plans must be continually audited for outcomes and fit with the current reality, and that's where metric tracking is really important. So 2 more slides. When you're in the implementation planning process of that final process of strategic planning, there are some really important questions that you want to be asking yourself. So one is, which path will this plan follow for implementation? So, in my organization in SHOP, more times than not, we're doing strategic planning for a department or an organization. So once we're done making the plan, we're not going to be very involved in that implementation. So it's a simple question, but it's an important one if you miss out on it. When we're done, when we're done the document and the plan is done, where's it going to go next? Who's going to be responsible for executing on it? And if you don't have an answer to that question, you're going to be in trouble. So, if our team recently did a strategic plan for our orthopedics, division of orthopedics. If I didn't, it's very simple, right? But if I didn't know who was going to execute on it, who's the chief of orthopedics, it's going to set up for failure. So we developed a plan in conjunction with the division chief, and as we were getting down to the level of tactics, right, for each of the 3 main strategic objectives, there's 5 tactics. Which person is going to be responsible for overseeing the execution of that tactic? And one of the, and it's going to be in the slides that you all get. In fact, actually, it's on the next slide, so we'll get there in a second. Who's responsible for leading the implementation? Who else needs to be involved? Again, why were we talking about systems thinking? Great, we have Division of Orthopedics we're doing a plan for. But who do they rely on a daily basis? They rely on imaging, radiology, physical therapy, the people in financial services that are getting the financial clearance so that our patients get approval by their insurance companies to go get the care. So if you don't understand the system, you can't identify who the key stakeholders are going to be to really make sure you're involving everyone. You need to ensure successful execution of the plan. Have interdependencies with other segments been identified? It's a similar concept. Really understanding where those interdependencies are and what are the barriers to implementation. This is important. Okay, we have the plan, and we said we have these targets we want to meet. Well, who's actually going to be doing the work of the work? I don't know, maybe it's an annual basis you decide, all right, well, I want to check in. Have we made any progress toward our target? Who's actually going to do that? Oftentimes, it's really not uncommon for a plan to be developed, and then a year later, it's like, well, are we being successful? I don't know, right? So who is the person that's going to take ownership to measure progress? Sometimes it makes sense to have an oversight body, a committee, that actually has the sole task of tracking that progress and also being that group that you can do scenario planning or pressure testing with a year out and say, did the world that we say, the way we said the world was going to look like in a year, did that turn out to be true? And you can have an oversight body to do that level of work and to be responsible for saying, yep, we're progressing the way we want it to progress, or said that we would progress. An oversight body is not always the right way to do it, right? I mean, if you're a department of 3 and the scope of your plan is pretty small, you don't need an oversight body. The 3 of you can just check in, right? But for a plan that's for a 20,000 person organization, we have an enterprise strategy committee, and they're key executives, and we meet every other month to go over progress. And every year we do that scenario planning exercise as one tactic to pressure test whether our plan is still a good plan. And then, I've been saying a lot that plans should be done every 5 years, but it's not like, it's not science. It depends. It depends. So a key question is, how often should we refresh it? And the things to think about when you're deciding how often to refresh is, well, how uncertain is my environment? How rapidly does my industry change? So in the technology industry, change is happening every single day. So it's probably not a good idea for them to be doing 10-year planning cycles. They might need to do an annual planning cycle, or maybe even a 6-month planning cycle. Healthcare, compared to tech, is much more static, right? Like, we don't have nearly as much change in healthcare as the tech industry does. So that's why we think 5 years is generally a good balance between change. And heck, we can't do it every year, right? That's a lot of work. So you have to strike that balance. So these are really important questions to ask before you're done the plan. This is the last slide. So this is an example from we did a primary care strategy. Does primary care resonate with people in the group? Like your family medicine, where you go for annual checkups, not like specialists, but the doc you might see every year to just get your cholesterol checked, right? And so we did a primary care strategy, and we had 3 key strategic objectives. One of them was to grow within our primary service area. The other one was to really deliver an exceptional patient experience. Just for some background, the reason why we chose the second one was, unlike our subspecialty divisions, where we're kind of the only game in town, there's not a lot of children's hospitals in our market, so we kind of, we are the place people go to. There's 1 million primary care providers in our network, so we can't rely on our reputation as a top-tier children's hospital as a key differentiator. So how we can differentiate ourselves in the primary care space is to have exceptional experience, to really make sure it's easy for people to access our services. And when they're in the clinic, they're having a good experience. So the plan, we had a new leader. The new leader was very ambitious. She wanted to tackle everything. So we actually had a lot of recommendations that boiled up to each of the strategic objectives. Here, recommendation, I've been using the word tactic. Same thing. And so we said, okay, over the course of a 5-year period, we're going to have to phase these tactics out over time, because we can't tackle everything in year 1. And so one way to think about, well, how do I know what to do in year 1 versus maybe start in year 3, is there's a lot of different things you can kind of factor into that equation. Some of the things that I think are most relevant are, how mature is our team or organization's capability to deliver on that? So if we still have work to do to get to the point where we can actually successfully start the initiative, then we might have to wait till year 3, because we have a lot of pre-work to do. And you can see every tactic or recommendation has a name next to it, right? You gotta have someone who is accountable for the work. If you don't, it's much less likely to succeed. So there are more example slides in this packet that you're all going to get that can help you think about and visualize successful strategy implementation. But that is what I have. But I'm curious to kind of close it out just with a conversation. What are some of the most important things people took away from this? What questions do you all have? What concerns do you have about doing a strategic planning process yourself?